The silence of the underground garage was always the worst part of my day, a concrete tomb that amplified the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. That evening, the air was thick with the smell of rain and exhaust fumes, a damp chill clinging to my thin housekeeper's uniform. I was just trying to get Lily to the car, her small hand clutched tightly in mine, her worn-out teddy bear tucked under her other arm. But she stopped dead, her eyes wide, fixed on the far end of the garage where a man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit was walking toward a gleaming black sedan. He moved with a kind of predatory grace I'd learned to fear, the kind of confidence that didn't need to be loud. Suddenly, Lily pulled her hand free and darted away from me, a tiny blur of pink against the grim gray. My blood ran cold. Before I could even scream her name, her little voice echoed, high and terrified, "Mister, don't get in your car." The man froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. He turned, his gaze locking onto my daughter. And in that split second, the world erupted in a blinding flash of orange and white, a roar of thunder that threw us both back against a concrete pillar. The world went silent for a moment, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. Dust and smoke filled my lungs, and the acrid smell of burnt metals stung my nostrils. My first, only thought was Lily. I scrambled to her, my hands shaking as I pulled her into my arms, shielding her head with my body even though the danger had already passed. She was trembling but unharmed, her face buried in my shoulder. When I dared to look up, I saw him, the man. He was standing there, untouched, a few yards from the twisted, flaming wreckage that had been his car. Shards of glass glittered like cruel diamonds on the oil-stained floor around him. He wasn't looking at the fire, he was looking at us. His face was a mask of cold control, but his eyes, dark and piercing, held an intensity that seemed to see right through me, pinning me in place. It's funny how your entire life can pivot on a single, terrifying moment. If you've ever felt that kind of bone-deep fear, that feeling of your world tilting on its axis, you know what I mean. If this story already has you on the edge of your seat, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Your support helps us share more stories like this one. Before that night, my life was already a carefully constructed house of cards, built on a foundation of fear and prayer. A year ago, I had finally found the courage to pack a single bag, grab Lily, and run from Javier, a man whose love felt more like ownership and whose hands left bruises that faded far slower than the memories. We ended up in this tiny, run-down apartment, the one with the leaky faucet and the neighbors who always fought. The six-figure medical debt Javier had left me with was a monster that lived in my mailbox, a constant, suffocating weight on my chest. I took the housekeeping job in that luxury high-rise because the pay was better than anything else I could find. I scrubbed floors and polished marble in apartments bigger than any house I'd ever been in, all while feeling like an invisible ghost. My only goal was to keep a roof over Lily's head, to give her a life where she didn't have to be afraid. I thought I had escaped the world of powerful, controlling men. I was wrong. I had just walked into the heart of a different, more dangerous kingdom, and I was about to meet its king. His name was Marco De Luca, though I only knew him as the owner of the penthouse suite, a place I cleaned 3 times a week but had never seen him in. The apartment was less of a home and more of a monument to power. It was all sharp angles, cold glass, and gleaming black surfaces that reflected a distorted version of my own tired face. There were no family photos, no clutter, no sign of a life lived within its walls, only an unnerving sense of order and control. The air itself felt different up there, thin and sterile, carrying the faint scent of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and cold like steel. I would imagine the man who lived there, a phantom built from the things he owned, the row of identical dark suits in the closet, the heavy, minimalist furniture, the panoramic view of a city that seemed to lay at his feet like a conquered territory. In my small, cluttered apartment, filled with Lily's colorful drawings and the smell of rice and beans, we were fighting to survive. In his world, survival seemed to be a given. The real game was dominance, and I was beginning to understand that I was cleaning the lair of a predator. 2 days after the explosion, the building manager called me. "Mr. DeLuca wants to see you," he said, his voice tight with a nervousness I had never heard from him before. In the penthouse, now, my stomach plummeted. I was sure I was being fired, or worse, blamed. Maybe they thought I had something to do with it, that I had let someone into the garage. My mind raced, picturing Javier finding us, trying to hurt me by going after my job. I left Lily with my neighbor, my hands trembling as I straightened my uniform, the cheap fabric feeling like a straitjacket. The elevator ride up to the top floor felt like a slow ascent to my own execution. Every floor we passed, the pressure in my ears grew, a physical manifestation of my rising panic. My past had taught me a brutal lesson. Powerful men don't summon the help for a friendly chat. They summon you to remind you of your place, to exert their control, to take something from you. As the polished steel doors slid open, revealing the familiar, sterile foyer of the penthouse, I took a deep breath and prepared for the worst, praying that whatever happened, it wouldn't cost me the one thing that mattered, my daughter's safety. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline, a silhouette against the gray afternoon light. He turned as I stepped inside, and the air was instantly sucked from my lungs. It was him, the man from the garage. Up close, he was even more imposing. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against the fabric of his dark gray suit. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection in an otherwise handsome, severe face. His eyes, the same ones that had been burned into my memory, were even darker in person, holding a chilling stillness. "Ms. Ramirez," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the vast, silent room, a low baritone that carried an undeniable weight of command. "Thank you for coming." I just nodded, unable to speak. He gestured to one of the stark leather couches, but I remained rooted to the spot. "My people have looked into what happened in the garage," he continued, his tone flat, transactional. "The device was professionally made. The people who put it there are not amateurs. They don't like to leave loose ends." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Your daughter saved my life, and in doing so, she made you both a target." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to grab Lily and disappear again, to find some forgotten corner of the world where monsters like Javier and men like this couldn't find us. But I knew it was a fantasy. I had nowhere left to run. His words hung in the air between us, cold and heavy as iron. "What do you want?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice hoarse. A flicker as something I couldn't decipher crossed his face before it settled back into a mask of indifference. "Want?" he repeated softly, as if the concept was foreign to him. "This isn't about what I want. This is about a debt, a life debt. In my world, that is the only kind that can never be negotiated." He took a step closer, and I fought the urge to flinch away. "The men who tried to kill me now know that a woman and a child saw them. They will not simply let that go. They will come for you, to silence you, or to use you against me." He stopped directly in front of me, his presence overwhelming. "You and your daughter will be coming with me. You will stay at my estate, where I can guarantee your safety. This is not a request, Miss Ramirez. It is the only way you both stay alive." My first instinct was to say no, to recoil from his offer as if it were a flame. My entire life since leaving Javier had been a frantic scramble for independence, for a world where I didn't have to answer to a powerful man. The thought of willingly walking into the orbit of someone like Marco DeLuca, a man whose car was a target for bombs, felt like a betrayal of the very freedom I had fought so hard to secure. "I can't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. yet filled with all the defiance I could muster. "We'll disappear. I've done it before. We'll go somewhere no one can find us." He just watched me, his expression unreadable, letting my panicked words fill the space between us. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply let me see the futility of my own plan. I knew, even as I said it, that running from men who plant bombs was a different league entirely from running from a local bully like Javier. His world had invisible, far-reaching tentacles, and I was just a woman with a 6-year-old and $100 to her name. Running was no longer an option. It was a death sentence. The consequences of my proximity to him were swift and brutal, a cascade of failures that proved his point more effectively than any argument could have. When I returned to my apartment, a bright orange eviction notice was taped to the door, a glaring symbol of my precarious existence. My landlord, a man who usually just grunted at me, had left a curt message saying my lease was terminated due to unforeseen security risks to the other tenants. An hour later, my phone rang. It was the building manager from my job, his voice strained and formal. He informed me that my employment was terminated, effective immediately. He didn't need to say why. I was collateral damage, a liability tied to the man in the penthouse. In a single afternoon, I had lost my home and my job. The fragile life I had painstakingly built for Lily and me had been demolished. I sat on the floor of our now temporary apartment, surrounded by packed boxes I didn't know where to take, the weight of Javier's 6-figure debt pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. I was completely, terrifyingly adrift, with no safe harbor in sight. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a ghost from my past materialized outside my building. Javier. He must have seen news reports of the explosion, seen the name of the building where I worked, and put the pieces together. He cornered me by the overflowing dumpsters, his familiar smirk twisting my stomach into a knot of cold dread. "Heard you're moving up in the world, Elena," he sneered, his eyes roaming over me with a possessive glare I knew all too well. "Working for fancy people. Maybe you finally have some of that money you owe me." He was referring to the medical bills from the night I'd finally fought back, the ones he'd somehow twisted to be my fault. When I tried to push past him, he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of my bicep. "Don't walk away from me," he hissed, his face close to mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. In that moment, I wasn't a survivor who had escaped. I was right back in that cramped apartment with him, small and powerless, the old fear a gag in my throat, silencing the scream that was building in my chest. A shadow fell over us, so sudden and complete that Javier flinched, his grip on my arm loosening. Marco De Luca stood there, not 5 feet away, a silent, imposing figure in a dark coat. He hadn't made a sound, simply appearing as if summoned by my terror. He didn't look at Javier with overt aggression. He just looked at him, his gaze flat and cold, like polished stone. It was an unnerving, predatory stillness that was far more frightening than any shouted threat. "Let her go," Marco said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that cut through the city noise. Javier, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He instantly dropped my arm, taking a stumbling step back as if he'd been burned. Marco's eyes flickered to the red marks forming on my skin, and a muscle in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't need to say another word. Javier mumbled something incoherent and practically fled, disappearing around the corner like the rat he was. Marco's gaze then met mine, and in it, I saw a flicker of something new, a cold, quiet rage that wasn't directed at me, but for me. It was a terrifying and strangely steadying thing to witness. He didn't say a word as he led me to his car, a different black sedan, just as immaculate as the last. He opened the back door for me, where Lily was already inside, buckled into a brand new car seat and watching a cartoon on a small screen, completely oblivious. She must have been with his man Leo, who I now saw sitting in the passenger seat. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken words as we drove away from the wreckage of my old life. I watched the grimy streets of my neighborhood give way to cleaner, wider avenues. Marco stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "In my family," he finally said, his voice low and devoid of emotion, "we have rules, codes. You don't put your hands on a woman. You don't harm a child. A man who does that is not a man. He is a disease that needs to be cleansed." He wasn't asking for my story about Javier. He was simply stating a fact, a core tenet of his world. It was a brutal, uncompromising philosophy, born of violence, yet in that moment, it felt like the most profound form of justice I had ever encountered. He was a monster, yes, but I was beginning to understand that his monstrosities were reserved for other monsters. He didn't say a word as he led me to his car, a different black sedan, just as immaculate as the last. He opened the back door for me, where Lily was already inside, buckled into a brand new car seat and watching a cartoon on a small screen, completely oblivious. She must have been with his man Leo, who I now saw sitting in the passenger seat. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken words as we drove away from the wreckage of my old life. I watched the grimy streets of my neighborhood give way to cleaner, wider avenues. Marco stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "In my family," he finally said, his voice low and devoid of emotion, "we have rules, codes. You don't put your hands on a woman. You don't harm a child. A man who does that is not a man. He is a disease that needs to be cleansed." He wasn't asking for my story about Javier. He was simply stating a fact, a core tenet of his world. It was a brutal, uncompromising philosophy, born of violence. Yet in that moment, it felt like the most profound form of justice I had ever encountered. He was a monster, yes, but I was beginning to understand that his monstrosities were reserved for other monsters. He took us to a sleek, anonymous high-rise downtown, an apartment that was clearly a safe house, impersonal but fortified. The windows were tinted, and the locks on the door looked like they could withstand a battering ram. Once Lily was safely asleep in a bedroom that seemed to have been furnished for her in a matter of hours, he turned to me. "This is my offer," he said, his tone shifting from personal to transactional, as if to give me distance. "I own the estate an hour north of the city. It is the most secure property on the East Coast. There is a private cottage on the grounds, separate from the main house. It will be yours." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I require a house manager to oversee the staff. The position is yours if you want it. The salary will be more than enough to handle your outstanding financial obligations. Your daughter will have private tutors, medical care, and 24-hour security. You will be safe. This is a business arrangement, Miss Ramirez, a way to clear the debt between us." He was offering me a golden cage, but he was also offering me the keys, framing it as a job, a way for me to retain some semblance of my pride. My mind was a battlefield. Every fiber of my being, conditioned by years of abuse, screamed that this was a trap. Powerful men didn't give gifts, they made investments. They offered security in exchange for ownership. I looked at him, this man who moved with the lethal grace of a panther, who spoke of cleansing people as if he were taking out the trash, and I saw the potential for a new kind of prison. The fear of trading Javier's fists for Marco's control was a suffocating wave. Yet, what was the alternative? A homeless shelter? Living in my car? Waiting for Javier to find me again? Or for Victor Petrov's men to finish the job they'd started? I thought of Lily, sleeping peacefully in the other room, her face untroubled. She deserved more than a life on the run. She deserved a bed to sleep in every night, a garden to play in, a world where she didn't have to be afraid. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My survival, and more importantly, hers, depended on the choice I made in this sterile, silent room. The impossible deal wasn't impossible at all. It was the only path forward. Still, I had to know. I needed to understand the man behind the offer, to see beyond the cold, transactional surface. I met his gaze, my heart pounding against my ribs, but I held my voice steady. "Why?" I asked, the single word hanging in the air. "It's more than a life debt, isn't it? Firing my landlord, getting me a job, setting up a life for us. What do you get out of this, Mr. DeLuca?" I expected him to deflect, to retreat behind his mask of cold authority. Instead, he looked away for a moment, his gaze fixed on the city lights below. When he looked back at me, the hard shield in his eyes had lowered, revealing a deep, ancient pain. "I had a sister," he said, his voice quiet, rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "Her name was Sophia. She was 17. My enemies, a different family, used her to get to me. They thought she was my weakness." He stopped, his jaw tight. They were right. I was too slow, too arrogant. I failed to protect her. I will not make that mistake again. It was a confession, a glimpse into the wound that drove him. That single, devastating revelation shattered my resistance. He wasn't just a mafia boss paying a debt of honor. He was a man haunted by a ghost, driven by a failure he could never undo. In his offer, I no longer saw a predator setting a trap, but a brother trying to atone for a sin that had defined his life. He wanted to protect us, not to own us, but because he had failed to protect someone else he loved. He saw his sister in my daughter. He saw a chance for redemption in my safety. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar companion in the pit of my stomach, but it was now joined by something else, something fragile and unexpected: empathy. I looked at this dangerous, broken man and saw a reflection of my own desperate need to protect the one person who mattered most. The choice was no longer a choice. It was an answer. "Okay," I whispered, the word a surrender and a beginning all at once. "We'll go with you." In that moment, I stepped out of the world I knew and into his, a kingdom of shadows, where, for the first time in a long time, I had the strange and terrifying hope that I might finally be safe. The DeLuca estate was less a home and more a small, fortified country. A winding private road led to a sprawling stone mansion surrounded by acres of manicured lawns, ancient oak trees, and a 10-foot-high wall topped with iron filigree that was likely electrified. Our cottage was a charming, 2-bedroom stone house set a discreet distance from the main residence, nestled by a serene-looking pond. It was beautiful, idyllic, and the most terrifying place I had ever been. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter in silent, precise patterns, their dark uniforms blending into the shadows. Leo Valenti, Marco's calm and watchful right-hand man, had walked me through the protocols with the detached air of a flight attendant explaining emergency procedures. There were panic buttons in every room. The windows were bulletproof. We were not to leave the cottage grounds without an escort. From our porch, I could see the main house, a silent monolith of dark windows. I often caught a glimpse of Marco's silhouette in one of them, a distant king surveying his domain, and us within it. I had run from a cage made of drywall and cheap locks, only to find myself in one made of marble and steel. The day after we arrived, Marco appeared at our door, holding a small, exquisitely carved wooden horse. Lily, who had been cautiously exploring the garden, ran to hide behind my legs, peeking out at the imposing man who had become our shadow. He knelt, his expensive suit creasing, and offered the toy to her without a word. Lily hesitated, then slowly took it, her tiny fingers tracing the smooth lines of the horse's mane. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second, before he stood and turned his gaze to me. "Leo will bring you the employment contract," he stated, his voice back to its usual flat baritone. "The terms are as we discussed." I bristled, my pride stinging. "I understand what you're doing, Mr. DeLuca," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "But I won't be a charity case." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even amusement, crossed his features. "Miss Ramirez," he said, his tone dangerously soft, "your only job here is to keep your daughter safe, and to follow my instructions. Everything else is just paperwork to allow you your pride. Do we have an understanding?" That night, the past came for us in our sleep. I woke to Lily's terrified screams, a sound that always tore through me like shrapnel. "No, get away from me," she cried, thrashing in her bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. I rushed to her side, gathering her into my arms, murmuring soothing words that felt useless against the terror in her voice. "It's okay, Mija. Mommy's here." That's when I saw him, a dark shape filling the doorway of her bedroom. Marco. He didn't step inside, respecting the threshold of our small sanctuary, but his presence was immense. His face, usually a mask of cold control, was tight with a raw, unfamiliar concern. He didn't speak to me. He spoke to Lily, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through her sobs. "There was once a little sparrow," he began, "who was afraid of the storm. But she had a secret. Her wings were stronger than the wind." He told a simple, quiet story, and as he spoke, Lily's trembling slowly subsided. She fell back asleep, clutching my arm. I looked at Marco, this killer, this monster, and saw a man haunted by the ghost of a storm he couldn't stop. The illusion of peace, however fragile, lasted for 3 days. I fell into a routine, overseeing the household staff as the house manager, a title that felt both absurd and necessary. I organized schedules, planned menus, and tried to pretend this was a normal job. But there was nothing normal about the way the guards' eyes constantly swept the horizon, or the low hum of the advanced security system that was always present, just beneath the sound of the wind in the trees. One morning, as I stepped out of the cottage to get some fresh air, Leo was there, his back to me. He was looking down at something on our welcome mat. When he turned, his face was a grim, stony mask. He quickly bent down and picked up a dead black crow, its wings stiff and unnatural. He saw the question in my eyes before I could ask it. "It's a message," he said, his voice low and hard. "From Petrov. It means he knows you're here. It means he's watching." He wrapped the bird in a cloth and walked away, leaving me standing in the pristine morning air, the cold dread of his words seeping into my bones. The war wasn't coming. It was already on our doorstep. Marco's reaction was swift and absolute. The estate went into a lockdown so complete it felt like we were living in a military compound. The number of guards doubled. Lily and I were forbidden from even stepping into the cottage garden without him or Leo personally escorting us. I felt the walls closing in, the beautiful prison becoming smaller and more suffocating with each passing hour. I finally snapped. I found him in the main house library, a vast, silent room filled with the scent of old leather and his expensive cologne. "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "She's a child. She needs to run, to play, to feel the sun without an armed escort. You're not protecting her. You're suffocating her." His eyes, when he looked up from the ledger he was studying, were as cold and hard as obsidian. "You think this is a game?" he hissed, rising to his full height. "You think I'm doing this for my own amusement? That bird on your doorstep was a promise. Viktor Petrov is promising me he will take from me what I care about. My rules are not a cage, Alina. They are the only reason your daughter is still breathing." The tension between us became a thick, suffocating fog, but beneath it, a new layer of fear was solidifying. The message with the crow wasn't just a threat. It was proof of a vulnerability I hadn't considered. It meant someone on the inside was feeding information to Viktor Petrov. During a tense, quiet dinner in the cottage that Marco insisted on attending for security reasons, Leo let it slip. "He thinks there's a traitor," he said, to me in a hushed tone while Marco was on the phone, his voice a low growl in the other room. "Someone on staff, someone with access. The information about your location was too specific, too fast." My blood ran cold. Suddenly, every polite gardener, every quiet housekeeper, every stoic guard, became a potential enemy. I started watching them, searching for a flicker of deceit in their eyes, a hint of falsehood in their smiles. I was living in a house of mirrors, where every reflection was a potential threat. For the first time, I began to understand the crushing paranoia that defined Marco's existence, the terrible price of his power. It wasn't just about fighting enemies you could see. It was about surviving the betrayal of those you couldn't. Despite the suffocating paranoia and our simmering conflict, he found a way to answer my plea. One morning, I woke to the sounds of quiet construction. I looked out the window and saw that the walled garden behind the main house, a space I thought was just for decoration, had been transformed. Overnight, his men had installed a beautiful, custom-built playground, a small wooden castle with a slide, a set of swings, and a sandbox filled with clean white sand. The entire area was now enclosed by a secondary, discreet security fence, monitored by its own set of cameras. It was a staggering, extravagant gesture, but it was also his silent apology, his compromise. He couldn't give Lily the world, so he had built her a small, perfect, and completely safe kingdom within his own. Later that day, I found him watching her from a distance, as she laughed, her joyous shrieks echoing in the quiet air. "Thank you," I said, softly, coming to stand beside him. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on my daughter. "Her laugh," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "It reminds me of my sister, Sophia." In that shared moment of fragile peace, the wall between us seemed to thin, just for a second. The peace was a fleeting illusion, a deep breath before the plunge. A few days later, a package arrived. It wasn't delivered by any of the usual couriers. Leo found it placed just inside the service gate, a clear breach of their security protocols. It was a simple, unmarked cardboard box addressed to me. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a porcelain doll. It was beautiful, with wide blue eyes and golden curls, and it was wearing a tiny, perfect replica of the pink press Lily had been wearing the day of the explosion in the garage. My heart stopped. My hands started to shake as I saw the small, folded note tucked into the doll's stiff fingers. I unfolded it with a sense of sickening dread. The message was typewritten, cold and precise. Such a pretty little doll, it would be a shame if she were broken. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. This was Viktor Petrov's handiwork, a move of calculated cruelty designed not to kill, but to terrorize. He was telling me and Marco that he could get to her. He was showing us that no wall was high enough, no fortress strong enough to keep him out. When Marco saw the doll, the air in the room grew cold enough to freeze water. The mask of controlled indifference he wore so constantly didn't just crack, it disintegrated, revealing a silent, terrifying rage beneath. His eyes became black holes of fury, and a muscle in his jaw pulsed violently. He took the doll from my trembling hands and, without a word, walked me from the cottage to the main house, his grip on my elbow firm but not painful, a grounding force in my spiraling panic. He led me into his office, a room of dark wood, leather, and screens. He tapped a few keys on a keyboard, and one of the large monitors flickered to life. The footage was from a playground near my old apartment, time-stamped 2 days before the explosion. It showed Lily on the swings, laughing, and on a bench nearby, a man was watching her. I recognized his face from a file Leo had shown me, one of Petrov's most ruthless enforcers. He was just feet away from her. "This is not a prison, Elena," Marco said, his voice a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the room. "It's the only sanctuary you have left. The war didn't start when my car exploded. It started the moment he laid eyes on her." The next week was a fragile truce with reality. Marco, in a gesture that felt both calculated and genuinely kind, suggested dinner out. Not at some five-star restaurant downtown, but a small, family-owned trattoria in a quiet neighborhood, a place he assured me was his. He wanted to give Lily a night of normalcy, a taste of the life I was afraid she was forgetting. The restaurant was warm and inviting, filled with the smell of garlic and baking bread. For an hour, we were almost a normal family. Lily was coloring on the paper placemat, and Marco was telling her a story about the owner's grandfather, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Then the world shattered. The front windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Two men in dark tactical gear stormed in, their weapons raised. Before I could even scream, Marco moved. He was a blur of motion, flipping our heavy wooden table on its side, shoving Lily and me behind it as gunfire erupted. He drew a weapon from an ankle holster I never knew he had and returned fire with a calm, terrifying precision. The fight was over in seconds, leaving two bodies on the floor and the air thick with the smell of cordite and fear. The ride back to the estate was a silent, screaming void. Lily had fallen asleep in my arms, exhausted by a terror she was too young to process. Leo drove, his face a grim, stony mask. Marco sat beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. Back in the cottage, after I put Lily to bed, I found him in the living room, staring into the cold fireplace. He had a long, shallow gash on his forearm from the flying glass, which was bleeding sluggishly onto the cuff of his pristine white shirt. I retrieved the first aid kit without a word and began cleaning the wound. He didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice, his eyes fixed on something far away. "That place," he finally said, his voice a raw whisper. "It was my father's favorite. We used to go there every Sunday. Sophia loved their cannoli." He wasn't just angry about the attack, he was wounded by the sacrilege. Petrov hadn't just tried to kill us, he had desecrated a memory, a piece of the life Marco had lost long ago. He was showing me that in his world, even the ghosts of the past were not safe from the violence of the present. As I carefully wrapped a bandage around his arm, the sterile silence of the cottage felt more intimate than any conversation. My hands were steady, a strange calm settling over me in the aftermath of the chaos. When I was with Javier, I heard myself say, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He once cornered me in the grocery store, in the middle of the day. He started screaming at me because I'd bought the wrong brand of coffee. He backed me into a shelf, knocking things over, and people just stared. They walked past with their carts, pretending they didn't see. No one said a word. No one helped. I looked up from Izarn and met his dark, intense gaze. I felt so small, so completely alone. Tonight, when those men came in, I was terrified, but I wasn't alone. The confession hung in the air between us, a fragile bridge built from our separate hells. I was admitting that his violence, as horrifying as it was, felt safer than the world's indifference. He had stood between us and the fire, a human shield, and in doing so had shown me a kind of protection I never knew existed. He reached out then, his uninjured hand coming up to cut my cheek, his thumb gently stroking my skin. The rough callus on his thumb was a stark contrast to the surprising softness of his touch. My breath hitched in my throat. The air between us grew thick and heavy, charged with all the unspoken fear and gratitude and a terrifying, magnetic pull that had been building for weeks. His eyes searched mine, no longer cold and guarded, but filled with a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored my own. I could see the battle raging within him, the protector warring with the predator, the man who wanted to pull me closer, fighting the ghost who warned him to push me away. He leaned in slowly, his gaze dropping to my lips, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he was going to kiss me. I wanted him to. But then he pulled back, his hand falling away, leaving my skin feeling cold and exposed. "This is a mistake, Alina," he rasped, his voice rough with conflict. "Anyone I care about becomes a target. I won't make you one." He turned and walked out of the cottage, leaving me alone with the echo of a promise he was terrified to make. The attack at the restaurant was more than a failed assassination. It was a clue. Marco became a man possessed, locking himself in his office with Leo for 2 days straight. They reviewed every frame of security footage, every financial transaction, every phone call made by every employee on the estate. The leak had to be internal. The timing of our visit to the trattoria was known only to a handful of people. Late on the second night, he summoned me to the main house. On the large monitor in his office was a close-up of a young woman's face. It was Maria, one of the junior housekeepers, a quiet girl I had taken under my wing. She was only 19. The screen split to show her bank records, a single, massive deposit made 2 days before the attack, wired from an offshore account with known ties to Petrov's syndicate. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. I had liked her. I had trusted her. I remembered her asking me innocently if Lily had any food allergies, a question that now seemed sinister and calculated. The betrayal was a physical blow, a harsh lesson that in this gilded cage, kindness was a currency the enemy could easily exploit. I didn't see what happened to Maria, and I was grateful for that. I only saw Leo escorting her out to a black car, her face ashen with a terror that went beyond just losing her job. She didn't struggle or cry out. She seemed resigned to a fate I couldn't bear to imagine. When I looked at Marco for an explanation, his face was carved from granite. Her parents in the old country, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Petrov got to them, threatened to kill them if she didn't cooperate. She gave him our location. He paused, his eyes meeting mine, holding a chilling certainty. She made a choice. She chose her family over ours. I understand that choice, but in this life, understanding doesn't change the consequences. She put your daughter in the line of fire. Betrayal is a disease, Alina. The only way to stop it from spreading is to cut it out completely. He wasn't apologizing or seeking my approval. He was stating the cold, brutal law of his world, a world where survival depended on an absolute, unforgiving code. And a part of me, the part that had seen Lily cowering behind that table, was horrified to find that it understood. That night, the dam of my composure finally broke. I found him on the terrace overlooking the dark, silent grounds, the weight of the day pressing down on me until I could barely stand. "I can't do this," I whispered, the words torn from my throat. "I can't raise my daughter like this, a world where a 19-year-old girl disappears because she was scared, where we can't eat a plate of pasta without a gunfight. I ran from a monster, Marco. I didn't want to end up living with a king of them." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cruel. He didn't get angry. He just turned, and in the pale moonlight, I saw a profound, soul-deep weariness in his eyes. "Come with me," he said. He led me through the silent house to a locked door I had never seen before. Inside was a small, simple room. It wasn't an office or a study. It was a shrine. The walls were covered with photographs of a smiling, dark-haired girl, Sophia. There were her childhood drawings, her riding trophies, a worn copy of her favorite book. "She was 17, he said, his voice thick with unshed grief. And I was arrogant. I knew they were watching me, but I didn't think they would dare. I failed her. My weakness, my love for her, is what they used to kill her. My fear, Alina, is not that I am a monster. My fear is that I will fail you and Lily just like I failed her." In that moment, standing in the silent, sacred space of his grief, everything shifted. The powerful Mafia boss, the cold-blooded killer, the untouchable king of this violent world, he was gone. In his place was a broken brother, a man haunted by a single, unforgivable failure. He wasn't protecting us out of a cold sense of honor or debt. He was protecting us to try and silence the ghosts that screamed his sister's name every time he closed his eyes. My fear and anger dissolved. replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it stole my breath. He was just as trapped as I was, imprisoned by a past he couldn't change. I stepped toward him and, without thinking, reached out and took his hand. His fingers, surprisingly cold, curled around mine, clinging to my touch as if it were a lifeline. "You failed her alone," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You won't be alone this time." It wasn't a declaration of love, but something far more profound. It was a vow of allegiance, a promise that we would face the coming storm together. Unseen by either of us, a tiny red light blinked once from a smoke detector on the ceiling. Viktor Petrov had found his leverage. He now knew that the way to destroy Marco DeLuca wasn't to take his life, but to take his heart. The bug in Sophie's room was the invisible dagger that finally found its mark. 2 days after our fragile truce in that hollowed space, a courier delivered a small, insulated box to Marco. Inside was a single, high-end audio player. He pressed play, and my own voice filled the silent office, a ghostly echo of my promise to him. "You won't be alone this time." The words, meant as a balm, had been twisted into a weapon. Viktor Petrov had been listening. He had violated Marco's most sacred memory, using my moment of empathy as an instrument of psychological torture. The warmth that had begun to thaw the ice around Marco's heart didn't just refreeze, it turned into a glacial wall. He looked at me, and I was no longer Elena. I was a security breach, a fatal miscalculation. The ghost of his sister stood between us, and his eyes, cold and distant, accused me of unlocking the door for her killers all over again. The guilt was a physical thing, a suffocating pressure in my chest that made it impossible to breathe. I was the weak point, the flaw in his fortress, and my very presence was the vulnerability that would bring his kingdom crashing down. The psychological warfare was merely the overture. The physical assault on his empire was swift, brutal, and devastatingly precise. Armed with the intimate knowledge gleaned from that hidden microphone, names, locations, shipment schedules I'd heard him discuss, Petrov began to systematically dismantle Marco's operations. A cargo container worth millions in untraceable electronics vanished from a secure port. 2 of his most loyal lieutenants, men whose names I'd heard spoken with reverence, were ambushed in a restaurant they believed was safe, their deaths a stark message to anyone still loyal to the DeLuca name. I watched from the periphery as Marco's world bled out. He became a phantom in his own home, a creature of clipped phone calls and cold fury, moving through the halls with a predatory stillness that terrified me more than any outburst. Leo Valenti's face grew grimmer with each passing hour, the numbers on his screen flashing red, charting the ruin I had brought upon them. My guilt was no longer a fear, it was a quantifiable fact, measured in the bodies of his men and the millions of dollars he was losing. I was a plague, and I was destroying everything he had built. The final, most vicious blow was aimed not at his business, but at his heart. Leo Valenti, the one man who had shown me consistent, gentle kindness, became the target. He was driving back to the estate, a route he had taken 1,000 times, when a truck forced his car over a ravine. He didn't die, but the man they carried back into the house was a broken version of the one who had left. His leg was shattered, and a deep gash on his forehead bled sluggishly, but the worst part was the look of defeat in his eyes. Marco's composure, the iron control he maintained at all times, finally fractured. He moved with a terrifying efficiency, barking orders for his private medical team, but as he knelt beside his oldest friend, his gaze met mine across the room. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound, soul-shattering look of confirmation. This was the price of attachment. This was the cost of letting someone in. Leo, who had urged him to trust me, who had seen us as a chance for redemption, was now paying for that sentiment in blood. The guilt was no longer something I could live with. It was a cancer, and the only way to save the host was to cut myself out completely. That night, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't be the reason another person he cared about was hurt or killed. My desperate need for safety had become a weapon turned against the very man providing it. To protect him, I had to disappear. I waited until the sterile silence of the estate was absolute, a suffocating blanket broken only by the distant crunch of a guard's boots on gravel. With trembling hands, I packed a small duffel bag with a few of Lily's clothes and the last of my cash, a mirror image of the night I had fled from Javier. My hands shook as I wrote a brief, gut-wrenching note and left it on the cool marble of the kitchen island. "I'm sorry for the danger I brought you. You'll be safer without us." It was a pathetic, inadequate apology for the ruin I had caused. I crept into Lily's room, her small form a peaceful silhouette in the moonlight. Waking her felt like a betrayal, my whispered explanation of a surprise trip a cruel lie. Her sleepy, trusting eyes looked up at me, and the love I saw in them was a shard of glass in my heart. I was ripping her away from the only stable home she had ever known, dragging her back into the terrifying uncertainty of the world. Fleeing the most secure compound on the East Coast with a 6-year-old in my arms was an act of pure, unadulterated madness. I was a housekeeper, not a spy, but desperation had become my closest companion, and I had spent weeks observing the patterns of my gilded cage. I knew there was a blind spot, a brief 5-minute interval between patrol shifts near a cluster of old pine trees at the edge of the property's service entrance. Holding a sleeping Lily, whose weight felt both impossibly heavy and reassuringly real, I slipped out of the cottage and into the cold, damp night. The darkness was absolute, a living thing that seemed to press in from all sides. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through me. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a wild bird desperate to escape. We reached the trees, their dense branches offering a temporary shield. Hiding there, with Lily's soft breath warming my neck, I was torn apart by the paradox of my actions. I was running toward unimaginable danger in a desperate attempt to leave Marco in safety. This gamble wasn't for my life, it was for his. The seconds stretched, each one a lifetime of suffocating fear. The distant hum of an electric cart faded, and the patrol was gone. This was my chance. I moved with a speed I didn't know I possessed, my body fueled by a potent cocktail of guilt and terror. I reached the service gate, a 10-foot wall of iron and unforgiving steel. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the keypad. I'd seen a gardener use it once, a fleeting observation I had filed away without knowing why. The code worked. A soft click echoed in the night, a sound as loud as a gunshot to my terrified ears. I pushed the heavy gate open just enough to slip through, pulling it shut behind me. We were out. The sudden, chilling freedom was more terrifying than the confinement had ever been. I stood on the edge of a dark, empty country road, the estate a silent fortress at my back. I started walking, my only plan to reach the bus station in the next town and vanish. But my freedom was a fleeting illusion. A pair of blinding headlights cut through the darkness, pinning me like a startled animal. A black sedan, sleek and predatory, glided to a stop beside me. The door opened, and Marco emerged from the driver's side, his silhouette a towering monument of cold, silent fury. "Did you really think I wouldn't know?" His voice was not a shout, but a low, guttural sound, the growl of a predator whose territory had been violated. It vibrated through the cold night air, through the soles of my shoes, and into the very marrow of my bones. That you could just walk out of my home with my child? He corrected himself instantly, his jaw tight. With your child. The correction was somehow worse, a deliberate severing of the fragile bond we had formed. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and a deep, agonizing pain that I had put there. "You think this protects me? Running away? You just handed Viktor Petrov his victory on a silver platter. You are walking into his arms." He stopped just inches from me, his presence overwhelming. "He is hunting you because you are my weakness, Elena. By doing this, you've just proven him right." I looked into his dark, unforgiving eyes and saw the devastating truth. My desperate attempt to save him was, in his world, the ultimate betrayal. I had shown him I didn't trust him to protect us. I had abandoned him in the middle of a war I had started. And in that moment, we were no longer allies. We were two broken people on opposite sides of a chasm I had created. He didn't bring me back to the cottage in a storm of shouts and accusations. The rage was there, a white-hot furnace behind his eyes, but it was contained, controlled, and that was infinitely more terrifying. He carried a sleeping Lily inside and laid her in her bed with a gentleness that felt like a physical blow to me. Then he turned, and his gaze was like a shard of ice in my heart. "Stay in the cottage," he commanded, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Do not leave. Do not speak to anyone. You are a guest here now, Miss Ramirez, nothing more." And then he was gone, leaving me in a silence that screamed with my failure. The estate transformed overnight. It was no longer a home, but a military command center. Men I'd never seen before, men with hard faces and the same cold stillness as their boss, moved through the grounds. I watched from the window as Marco, a remote general, directed his war from the screens in his office, his face a mask of stone. My reckless bid for his safety had only sharpened his isolation, reinforcing his belief that caring for someone was a fatal flaw. I had run to save him, and in doing so, had become the very ghost he'd been running from his entire life, the embodiment of a weakness he could not afford. I refused to be a ghost in my own life, a passive liability waiting for the war to end. The guilt was a physical weight, but beneath it, a new, harder resolve was forming. I was the one who had been in Sophia's room. I was the one who had spoken the words that Petrov had twisted into a weapon. I replayed every second of that conversation in my mind, every word Marco had spoken in his grief. He'd mentioned a name, Dmitry Volkov, an old-world figure who was a contemporary of his father and Petrov's. He'd called him a snake, a man who played both sides, now supposedly retired and neutral. Marco would never trust him, but I saw a sliver of an opportunity. A snake could be charmed, or it could be threatened. It was a desperate, insane long shot, but it was mine. He didn't bring me back to the cottage in a storm of shouts and accusations. The rage was there, a white-hot furnace behind his eyes, but it was contained, controlled, and that was infinitely more terrifying. He carried a sleeping Lily inside and laid her in her bed with a gentleness that felt like a physical blow to me. Then he turned, and his gaze was like a shard of ice in my heart. "Stay in the cottage," he commanded, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Do not leave. Do not speak to anyone. You are a guest here now, Miss Ramirez, nothing more." And then he was gone, leaving me in a silence that screamed with my failure. The estate transformed overnight. It was no longer a home, but a military command center. Men I'd never seen before, men with hard faces and the same cold stillness as their boss, moved through the grounds. I watched from the window as Marco, a remote general, directed his war from the screens in his office, his face a mask of stone. My reckless bid for his safety had only sharpened his isolation, reinforcing his belief that caring for someone was a fatal flaw. I had won to save him, and in doing so, had become the very ghost he'd been running from his entire life, the embodiment of a weakness he could not afford. I refused to be a ghost in my own life, a passive liability waiting for the war to end. The guilt was a physical weight, but beneath it, a new, harder resolve was forming. I was the one who had been in Sophia's room. I was the one who had spoken the words that Petrov had twisted into a weapon. I replayed every second of that conversation in my mind, every word Marco had spoken in his grief. He'd mentioned a name, Dmitry Volkov, an old-world figure who was a contemporary of his father and Petrov's. He'd called him a snake, a man who played both sides, now supposedly retired and neutral. Marco would never trust him, but I saw a sliver of an opportunity. A snake could be charmed, or it could be threatened. It was a desperate, Insane long shot, but it was mine. I couldn't go to Marco. He had walled himself off, and my confession would sound like more foolishness. Using the burner phone Leo had given me weeks ago for emergencies, a device I was sure Marco was monitoring, I started digging, searching for a way to reach the one man in this violent world who might hold the key to ending it, knowing that using the phone was the same as raising a flag to both my protector and my hunter. My search led me to an encrypted messaging service, a digital shadow world where men like Dimitri conducted their affairs. I sent a single, carefully worded message, identifying myself only as the woman in the DeLuca cottage and claiming to have information that could be leveraged against Marco, something that would give the Volkov family an advantage when the dust settled between DeLuca and Petrov. It was a lie, a piece of bait dangled in dark water, and I knew it was more likely to get me killed than to get me a meeting. But to my astonishment, a reply came within hours, a time and a place, an abandoned cathedral on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place of crumbling faith and forgotten sins. It was a trap. I knew it with every fiber of my being, but it was also the only move I had left on the board. I couldn't let Marco fight this war alone, a war I had escalated. I wrote him a note, not of apology, but of intent. He thinks I am your weakness. I'm going to prove him wrong. Cathedral of St. Jude. I left it on his desk, a final, desperate plea for him to trust me, just this once, and walked out of the cottage and into the belly of the beast. The air inside the cathedral was thick with the smell of decay and damp stone, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Light struggled through the grimy, shattered stained glass windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the gloom. He was there, standing before the ruined altar, not Dimitri, but Viktor Petrov himself. His smile was a thin, cruel slash in his pale face. "I am so glad you came, Elena," he said, his voice a soft, cultured purr that made my skin crawl. "I must confess, I did not think Marco's taste would be so pedestrian, but he seems quite taken with you." He gestured, and shadows detached themselves from the pillars, a dozen of his men, all armed. "He is on his way, you know. Your little note was delivered. He is coming to save his weakness, and he will walk right into this kill box. But first, he will watch. He will watch me break his new favorite toy. It is the only way to teach a man like him a lesson about love." He raised a pistol, the small, dark hole of the barrel an abyss. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice, when I spoke, was steady. "You don't understand," I said. "You think love is his weakness. You're wrong. It's his armor." Just as Petrov's finger tightened on the trigger, the world erupted. The remaining stained glass windows didn't just shatter, they disintegrated inward in a shower of colored glass and concussive force. Marco's men, clad in black tactical gear, rappelled down from the high rafters and swarmed in through every entrance, a silent, disciplined wave of violence. It wasn't a reckless charge. It was a perfectly executed symphony of destruction. Marco had known. He had been tracking the phone, read my note not as a plea, but as a strategic signal. He had trusted me. As chaos swirled around us, he moved with a singular, lethal purpose, his eyes locked on Petrov. The two men met in the center of the nave, a clash of kings. But I was no longer a bystander. I was a part of this. Seeing Petrov momentarily distracted, I grabbed a heavy, fallen iron cross from the rubble and swung it with all my might, catching him squarely in the back of the knee. He buckled with a roar of pain, his focus broken for a single fatal second. It was all the time Marco needed. The fight was over. Marco stood over his fallen rival, his chest heaving, and then his eyes found mine. And in them, I saw not the coldness of a killer, but the fierce, desperate relief of a man who had almost lost everything. We stood on the terrace later that night, the war over, the estate wrapped in a profound and unfamiliar peace. Lily was asleep, her nightmares finally silenced. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of rain-washed earth. Marco came to stand beside me, the tension gone from his shoulders for the first time since I'd met him. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a gesture that felt more binding than any vow. "I was wrong," he said, his voice a low, rough sound that was for my ears alone. "I spent years building walls, believing isolation was strength. I thought protecting you meant keeping you behind them. But tonight, you fought with me. You stood beside me. You weren't a weakness to be sheltered. You were my partner." He turned to face me, his dark eyes searching mine, stripped of all their armor, revealing the haunted, hopeful man beneath. "This was never about a debt, Elena. Not really. This is my life. This is my world, and I don't want to live in it alone anymore." He wasn't asking me to be his housekeeper or his ward. He was asking me to be his equal, his family. I looked at this dangerous, beautiful man, my protector, my king, and I knew I had finally found the one place I was never meant to run from. "We're home," I said, and squeezed his hand, choosing this life, this man, this future, without a single shred of doubt. The months that followed were a slow, deliberate exhale after a lifetime of holding my breath. The estate, once a fortress bristling with tension, softened back into a home. The extra guards vanished, replaced by the quiet hum of gardeners and the scent of freshly cut grass. Marco's war was over, but his work was just beginning. I watched as he methodically rebuilt his world, not as it was, but as he wanted it to be. He severed ties with his more volatile associates, absorbing massive financial losses with a calm resolve that spoke of a new set of priorities. He started channeling his immense resources into legitimate ventures, a process he insisted I be a part of. I found myself sitting beside a recovering Leo in Marco's office, my opinions on architectural plans and investment portfolios not just heard, but sought. The surveillance screens that once showed enemy movements now displayed market trends and blueprints for a new community center. We were no longer just surviving a war. We were actively building a peace, brick by painstaking brick. And for the first time, I felt like an architect of my own future, not just a resident in someone else's. Our new life took root in the small, quiet moments. Leo, now walking with a silver-headed cane that he wielded with a certain dramatic flair, became Lily's favorite storyteller, his grim past repurposed into cautionary fairy tales where the good guys always won. I enrolled in online business management courses, the lessons filling the quiet hours after Lily was asleep, my mind hungry for a new kind of knowledge that had nothing to do with survival. The six-figure debt from Javier, that monster that had haunted my every waking moment, was erased with a single phone call from Marco's lawyers, a quiet display of power that felt more profound than any act of violence. We moved into the main house, our little stone cottage becoming a place for guests, a relic of a past we had outgrown. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to find Marco, his sleeves rolled up, patiently showing Lily how to fold tortellini, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle. He looked up and caught my eye, a dusting of flour on his cheek, and in that simple domestic scene, I saw the ghost of the lonely king in the penthouse finally laid to rest. One cool autumn evening, he took me to the city. He drove us to the small, quiet neighborhood where the trattoria had been. It was no longer a ruin of shattered glass and painful memories. It had been reborn, warmer and more inviting than before, the windows glowing with soft light. He led me inside, where the owner, a man with tears in his eyes, handed me a set of keys and a thick folder. Inside was the deed to the restaurant, transferred to my name. "It's yours," Marco said, his voice low and steady as we stood alone in the empty dining room. "A place to build something that belongs only to you. I'm not giving you a cage, Elena. I'm giving you an anchor, a place to be your own boss." I looked from the keys in my hand to the face of this man who had shown me the meaning of protection. He wasn't giving me a gift. He was giving me back a piece of myself I thought I had lost forever. My agency, my independence. He was proving that his love wasn't about control, but about creating a space where I could finally, safely grow. Now, I watch my daughter chase fireflies in the twilight of the estate garden, her laughter echoing in the peaceful air, a sound that has become the anthem of our new life. She is safe, she is happy. Those two simple truths are a miracle I will never take for granted. Marco comes to stand beside me, his arm wrapping around my waist in a familiar, comforting gesture. He no longer looks like a king surveying his domain, but a man watching his world. We are a family, forged not in a church or a courtroom, but in the crucible of fear and loyalty, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most dangerous man can be the only safe harbor in a storm. My life of running is over. I have found my home in the heart of a man who once seemed like the embodiment of everything I feared. It's a profound reminder that even in a world that can feel so cold, there are stories of redemption waiting to be found. Sharing them and finding hope in them is so important, which is why your support means everything in helping others discover a story like this one.